You think this is acceptable? You think I pay the outrageous fees this establishment demands to be handled by the likes of you? The voice cut through the controlled chaos of the Arlington Fairfax Emergency Department like a scalpel through flesh, sharp, precise, and designed to wound. Look at you. What kind of third-rate charity case are they letting into the ER now? Get your hands off me! Noah Hill stood 6'2" in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, his bow tie perfectly centered, his cufflinks catching the harsh fluorescent light. His finger jabbed the air inches from Annabelle Sam's face, each word dripping with the kind of contempt that only comes from a lifetime of unchallenged privilege. I demand the chief of medicine, now. I want to speak to someone who understands what money means, not someone wearing these ridiculous, stained yellow rags. Annabelle Sam, 26 years old, and dressed in saffron yellow scrubs that marked her as ED general nursing staff, stood perfectly still. Her dark brown eyes met his furious glare without flinching. Her hands, which had been gently taking his pulse just moments before, now hung calmly at her sides. Behind her, 3 other nurses in identical yellow scrubs had frozen mid-task, their faces reflecting shock, anger, and a familiar, bitter recognition. The man before her wasn't just angry. He was performing, putting on a show for the small crowd that had gathered. His personal assistant clutching a tablet, 2 security guards hovering uncertainly near the entrance, and the nursing supervisor who had just emerged from the medication room with a look of poorly concealed satisfaction on her pale face. But Annabelle noticed something none of them did, something that made her stomach drop and her pulse quicken. Not from fear of his words, but from fear for his life. Welcome back to the channel. Where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? I'm curious to see how far this story is reaching. What is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it the zeros in their bank account? The brand of their suit? The volume of their voice when they demand respect? Or is it something quieter? Something that shows itself not in what you wear, but in what you do when no one is looking, when the cameras are off, when the person you save is the same person who just tried to destroy you. It was 4:15 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, the most dangerous hour in any urban emergency department. The shift change was 30 minutes away, which meant the day staff was exhausted and the night staff hadn't arrived. Trauma bays 1 through 4 were occupied. A construction accident, a cardiac event, a pediatric asthma crisis, and a motorcycle collision. The waiting room was standing room only, and in the middle of it all stood Noah Hill, tech billionaire, hospital megadonor, and, according to his own assistant's whispered explanation, a man who had just walked out of a $50,000 a plate charity gala at the Four Seasons to come to the ED because he felt off. Arlington Fairfax Hospital wasn't a community clinic. It was a cathedral of medicine, funded by foundations and billionaires like Noah Hill himself. The marble floors in the lobby cost more than most people's homes. The diagnostic equipment was cutting edge. The staff was supposed to be world-class. But money doesn't buy humility, and it certainly doesn't buy immunity from biology. Annabelle Sam had earned her registered nursing license the hard way. While her classmates at the state nursing program worried about sorority rush and spring break plans, Annabelle worked double shifts at a nursing home, took night classes, and came home to a grandmother dying slowly from congestive heart failure in a subsidized apartment that smelled like menthol and Bengay. She'd graduated with honors, not summa cum laude, because she'd had to drop 1 semester when her grandmother's care became too intensive, but with honors. She'd passed her NCLEX on the first try. She'd been hired at Arlington Fairfax because the diversity initiative required it, but she'd stayed because she was exceptional. The yellow scrubs she wore today, the ones Noah Hill was mocking, represented her current rotation in the general ED. They didn't show the 16-hour shift she'd just worked covering for a colleague with COVID. They didn't show the 10 years she'd spent bathing, feeding, and medicating her grandmother while her mother worked 3 jobs. They didn't show the acceptance letter to Georgetown Medical School that sat in her locker, unopened, because the $300,000 tuition might as well have been $300 million. Her dark skin, which Hill's eyes had flicked over with barely concealed disdain, was a shade darker today from exhaustion. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, professional bun. Her stethoscope, the cheap one she'd bought on Amazon for $23 because the good ones cost $200, hung around her neck. But beneath the fatigue, beneath the cheap equipment and the dollar store scrubs, was a mind sharper than any scalpel in the surgical wing. Annabelle Sam had something that couldn't be taught in medical school: an observational genius born from necessity. Growing up poor meant you learned to notice things others missed: the slight color change in someone's complexion that meant they'd skipped their blood pressure medication, the tremor in a hand that suggested more than just nerves, the smell on someone's breath that revealed what their words wouldn't. She'd kept her grandmother alive for 3 years longer than any doctor predicted, not with expensive treatments, but with attention. And right now, she was paying attention to Noah Hill in a way he couldn't possibly understand. Noah Hill defined nouveau riche. At 45, he controlled Horizon Tech, a global data monolith that had made him a billionaire by the time he was 32. He owned a penthouse in Manhattan, a villa in Tuscany, and a private island in the Maldives that he'd visited exactly once. His tuxedo, the one he wore to this evening's gala, cost $12,000. His watch cost more than Annabelle's annual salary. He'd arrived at the gala in a Bentley with his fourth wife, a former model 20 years his junior, who was currently shopping in Paris and completely unaware her husband was in an emergency room. Hill had felt off during the cocktail hour, a tightness in his chest, a wave of dizziness, a slight nausea that champagne hadn't helped. His assistant, Percival Vance, had insisted he come to Arlington Fairfax just to be safe. Hill had agreed, not because he was worried, but because he assumed a hospital visit would take 20 minutes, provide reassurance, and make Percival stop hovering. Instead, he'd been taken to the ED, not the VIP medical suite on the 8th floor, and assigned to Nurse Annabelle Sam, who had calmly asked him to remove his jacket so she could take his blood pressure. The indignity of it had been immediate and overwhelming. Hit that like button right now if you've ever dealt with someone who thought their bank account made them better than everyone else. You know exactly who I'm talking about. In Noah Hill's world, respect was purchased. Deference was mandatory. He saw every interaction as a transaction, and the person in front of him, this young black woman in discount scrubs with a cheap stethoscope, registered as someone far, far below his station. He didn't see a nurse. He saw a servant, and servants didn't give orders to kings. Gwendolyn Pritchett stood near the nurse's station, her arms crossed over her pristine white supervisor's coat. At 55, she'd worked at Arlington Fairfax for 30 years and wore her seniority like armor. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe bun. Her expression was one of barely concealed satisfaction. She'd been waiting for Annabelle to slip up. And now, with Noah Hill, the Noah Hill, whose name was literally engraved on a plaque in the cardiac wing, publicly dressing down this upstart young nurse, Gwendolyn saw vindication. She saw an opportunity. She saw the natural order being restored. Dr. Cassian Thorne observed from the triage desk, his expression carefully neutral. At 30, he was a promising internal medicine resident whose family fortune rivaled Hill's. He'd gone to Exeter, then Yale, then Johns Hopkins. He knew men like Hill intimately, had grown up with them, gone to boarding school with them, learned their language of entitlement and power. But he'd also worked with Annabelle Sam for 6 months. He'd watched her catch a medication error that would have killed a diabetic patient. He'd seen her correctly identify a rare autoimmune condition that 3 attendings had missed. He respected her in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable with what he was witnessing now. But he stayed silent, because speaking up would cost him nothing professionally, but might cost him something socially, and in the world of academic medicine, those social costs mattered. Nurse Zuri Kenyatta, 24 and fresh out of nursing school, stood frozen near the crash cart. She was Annabelle's closest friend on the unit, the only other black nurse on the day shift, and her hands were clenched into fists. She wanted to intervene, wanted to tell this pompous man exactly what she thought of him. But she also wanted to keep her job. And Gwendolyn Pritchett had made it very clear. Nurses who caused problems didn't last long at Arlington Fairfax. Annabelle kept her voice low, professional, steady. The voice of someone who had learned long ago that raising your voice when you were already perceived as aggressive only made things worse. "Mr. Hill," she said, "I understand your frustration. However, Dr. Thorne has ordered a basic workup for your symptoms." "Symptoms?" Hill's face flushed a dangerous mottled red. "Symptoms? These aren't symptoms, they're insults. I came here as a courtesy. And I'm being treated like some homeless person who wandered in off the street." He jabbed his finger closer to her face, and Annabelle caught a whiff of his breath. Expensive scotch, yes, but underneath it, something else, something metallic. "You don't understand anything," Hill continued, his voice rising. "You understand charts and bedpans and probably which bus route gets you to your studio apartment in whatever crime-ridden neighborhood you came from. Meanwhile, I'm the one who paid for this wing. Do you see that cardiac equipment over there? I donated it." He pointed at the state-of-the-art defibrillator mounted on the wall. "You're standing here wearing my yellow cotton, in my hospital, and you have the audacity, the sheer, unbelievable audacity, to lecture me about protocols?" Gwendolyn stepped forward, her posture rigid with officious righteousness. "Nurse Sam?" Her voice cracked like a whip. "Step away from Mr. Hill immediately. He is a valued patron of this institution, and if he prefers to speak with a physician, that is his right. I will handle this situation. If you're already angry at Gwendolyn, just wait. What she does next is going to make your blood boil. Keep watching. You need to see this." Annabelle didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Noah Hill's face, specifically on his neck, where his collar met his skin. There, a small, barely visible brown smudge on his otherwise pristine white collar. Not dirt, not makeup. Dried blood. Her mind raced through the differential diagnosis. The metallic breath, the mottled complexion, the tightness he'd described, the slight swelling she'd noticed in his left jugular vein. The fact that his pulse, when she'd checked it, had been thread-like and racing. 140 beats per minute, far too fast for simple anxiety. This wasn't a panic attack. This wasn't heartburn. This wasn't the hypochondria of a rich man with too much time on his hands. This was a ticking time bomb. "Mr. Hill," Annabelle said, her voice taking on an edge of urgency that cut through his tirade. "I need you to remain still for just one more minute. Your heart rate is elevated, your skin turgor is slightly off, and I'm concerned about—" "I told you to leave!" Hill roared, his eyes bulging. "This is exactly what happens when hospitals lower their standards, when they let just anyone, put on scrubs and pretend to be qualified." He turned to Gwendolyn, his face now an alarming shade of crimson. "I want this woman written up. I want her reprimanded. I want her sent back to whatever nursing home she came from. She is a liability, a disgrace. I will personally see to it that she never works in a reputable medical facility again." Annabelle took a slow breath. Every instinct she'd honed over 10 years of caregiving was screaming at her that this man was in immediate danger. But she also knew that forcing care on someone against their will, especially someone this powerful, could end her career before it even truly began. "Your words are noted, Mr. Hill," she said quietly. "Please be aware that refusing medical care against recommendation places the responsibility for any adverse outcomes on you." Hill sneered, his victory complete. He straightened his bow tie with trembling fingers, another detail Annabelle noted, and turned sharply on his heel. "The only adverse outcome here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "will be yours, Nurse Sam. Consider your employment here finished." His expensive leather shoes clicked against the tile floor as he strode toward the exit, his assistant scrambling to keep up, his head held high with the absolute certainty of a man who had never, not once in his entire privileged life, faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Annabelle watched him go, her hand already moving to her pocket where she kept her personal penlight. She glanced at the clock. 4:17 p.m. She gave him 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then she turned to the supply cabinet, ignoring Gwendolyn's sharp command to report to her office immediately, and began gathering supplies with swift, practiced movements. Large-bore IV catheter, bags of normal saline, trauma shears, and, most importantly, the specialized emergency suture kit from the locked cabinet that only senior trauma nurses were supposed to access. Zuri caught her eye, her expression confused and worried. Annabelle mouthed 2 words. "He's bleeding." Then she walked toward the main lobby, her yellow scrubs bright against the sterile white walls, carrying supplies that would either save a life or end her career. Possibly both. But to understand why Annabelle Sam was willing to risk everything, her job, her license, her dream of medical school, for a man who had just tried to destroy her, you have to understand where she came from. You have to understand the 10-year journey that had taught her a simple truth. A person's life doesn't have a price tag, and dignity isn't something you wear. It's something you earn. Annabelle's grandmother had taught her that lesson on a humid August night when Annabelle was 16. They'd been sitting in the emergency room of County General, the Poor People's Hospital, as the cab driver had called it, waiting for someone, anyone, to see the elderly woman struggling to breathe. 4 hours they'd waited while her grandmother's lips turned blue and her breathing grew shallower. "Baby," her grandmother had whispered, gripping Annabelle's hand with surprising strength. "Don't ever let them make you feel small. Your worth ain't in your wallet, it's in your hands, in what you do when nobody's watching." 6 hours later, a tired resident had finally examined her, prescribed an inhaler, and sent them home. Her grandmother lived another decade, but that night planted a seed that would grow into Annabelle's entire philosophy of care. Everyone deserves to be seen, even the people who refuse to see you. Subscribe right now if you believe healthcare should be about saving lives, not bank accounts. This story is just getting started, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Annabelle moved with purpose toward the supply room, her mind racing through the clinical picture. The thread-like pulse, the mottled skin, the dried blood, the metallic breath. It all pointed to one catastrophic diagnosis. "Annabelle, what are you doing?" Zuri appeared beside her, her voice low and urgent. "Gwendolyn just told you to report to her office." "You're making this worse." Annabelle pulled open the locked trauma cabinet with her override key, the one she technically wasn't supposed to have, but that the night-charge nurse had given her after she'd saved a coding patient last month. "That man is bleeding internally," Annabelle said, her hands moving quickly through the supplies. Large-bore IV catheter, 2 bags of normal saline, trauma shears, the specialized suture kit. "I think he has a ruptured esophageal varix." Zuri's eyes widened. That's a rare." "I know." Annabelle's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she checked the expiration date on the clotting factor. "Portal hypertension, probably undiagnosed. The stress and rage just spiked his blood pressure enough to rupture it. He's been bleeding slowly for hours, maybe days. That brown smudge on his collar? Old blood from minor bleeds. But the big one's coming." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've seen it before." Annabelle's voice went quiet. "My uncle. He was a drinker. Same presentation. He made it to the hospital, but he didn't make it out." Zuri grabbed her arm. "If you're wrong about this..." "I'm not wrong." Annabelle met her friend's eyes. "But if I wait for permission, for protocol, for Dr. Thorne to run tests that Hill will refuse anyway, he'll be dead in 10 minutes. She tucked the supplies into a portable crash kit, concealing them beneath sterile drapes. "This is career suicide," Zuri whispered. "Maybe." Annabelle shouldered the kit. But letting someone die when you know how to save them? That's soul suicide, and I can't afford that. Across the ED, Noah Hill was signing his AMA against medical advice, discharge papers, with aggressive strokes of the pen, already composing the lawsuit in his head. Dr. Thorne watched with diplomatic discomfort, but said nothing. Gwendolyn stood beside Hill, practically glowing with vindication. "I'll personally see that your supervisor hears about your gross insubordination," Hill announced loud enough for the entire department to hear. "I'll make sure you go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." In Hill's mind, this was simply another hostile takeover, the kind he'd executed dozens of times in boardrooms across the world. Identify the weak link. Apply pressure. Eliminate the obstacle. Money was power, and power meant you never had to be wrong. His first major acquisition had been a family-owned pharmaceutical company. The founder's son had pleaded with him to reconsider, to honor his father's legacy. Hill had smiled and signed the papers that would liquidate 70 years of family business. "Business is business," he'd said, "and sentiment doesn't pay dividends." Now, watching this nurse be put in her place, he felt that same satisfaction. The natural order restored, the hierarchy maintained. He straightened his bow tie, ignoring the tremor in his fingers, and strode toward the exit. Annabelle watched him go, the crash kit heavy in her hands, and started counting. 10, 9, 8. "Nurse Sam!" Gwendolyn's voice cut through the ED's ambient noise like a blade. "I have formally ordered you to report to Human Resources immediately for documentation of this incident. Your insubordination." But Annabelle was already moving. Pushing through the security doors that separated the emergency department from the main hospital lobby. The crash kit bounced against her hip. Her yellow scrubs were a bright slash of color against the sterile corridor. Behind her, Gwendolyn's protests faded into white noise. 7, 6, 5. The main lobby of Arlington Fairfax Hospital was a cathedral of wealth and power. Soaring 30-foot ceilings. Italian marble floors that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with golden late-afternoon light. The hospital's logo, a stylized heart wrapped in elegant script, was etched in gold on the central wall. Today, it was also crowded. Director Sterling Vaughn, 62, and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, stood near the information desk greeting reporters and camera crews. The hospital was hosting a press conference in 20 minutes. Something about a new cancer research grant, a photo opportunity with donors and board members. Influential people milled about, board members in designer suits, local politicians, wealthy benefactors, their wives dripping with jewelry. Camera lights were being tested. A podium was being adjusted. It was a perfect stage for triumph, or catastrophe. Annabelle's internal conflict was a physical weight in her chest. Gwendolyn's threat wasn't empty. Refusing a direct order to report to HR was grounds for immediate termination, possibly even license suspension. And without her license, medical school would remain forever out of reach. But her grandmother's voice was louder. "Don't ever let them make you feel small." 4? 3? She spotted Hill immediately. He was impossible to miss in his tuxedo, cutting through the crowd like a shark through water, his assistant scrambling to keep pace. He was heading for the revolving doors at the lobby's far end, already pulling out his phone to presumably call his lawyer. Annabelle estimated she had less than 5 minutes before his blood pressure dropped low enough to send him into hypovolemic shock. Maybe less. The human body could compensate for internal bleeding for a surprisingly long time, until suddenly, catastrophically, it couldn't. She positioned herself near the central corridor, crash kit in hand, ignoring the curious stares from well-dressed strangers who wondered why a nurse was standing in the lobby holding emergency equipment. 2, 1. Noah Hill took his 10th step into the lobby. Then he stopped. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The color drained from his face like water from a broken glass. His skin shifting from mottled red to an otherworldly, ghastly white in the span of a single heartbeat. His hand flew to his stomach, fingers clawing at the expensive fabric of his tuxedo. His eyes went wide with primal fear, the kind of fear that comes when your body suddenly betrays you in a way your mind can't process. He opened his mouth, perhaps to call for help, perhaps to breathe. Instead, he retched. What came out wasn't food or bile. It was blood. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, drop a comment with a heart emoji. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, do it now. Because what Annabelle does next will blow your mind. Not a trickle, not a concerning amount. A deluge. Bright red arterial blood mixed with dark, clotted material that had been pooling in his esophagus and stomach for hours. It erupted from his mouth like a terrible fountain, spraying across the pristine marble floor, across his $12,000 tuxedo, across the shocked faces of the people nearest him. Hill collapsed. Not a gentle faint. A violent, bone-cracking fall as his knees buckled and his body hit the marble with a sickening thud. The blood kept coming, pooling around him in an ever-widening circle that reflected the golden afternoon light in horrifying crimson. For one frozen moment, the entire lobby was silent. Then the screaming started. Women in evening gowns backed away, hands over their mouths. Men in suits stood paralyzed. A camera fell from someone's hands and shattered on the marble. Director Vaughn's face went from professional smile to mask of horror in an instant. And at the ED entrance, Gwendolyn Prichette stood frozen, one hand gripping the doorframe, her face the color of ash. She'd been wrong. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. The patient she'd dismissed, the diagnosis she'd ignored, the nurse she'd silenced. Annabelle was already running. Her yellow scrubs flashed like a warning sign as she dropped to her knees beside Noah Hill's convulsing body, the crash kit hitting the marble with a sharp crack. "Someone call a code!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "Get me a crash cart from the ED, now!" But she wasn't waiting for permission. She was already working. The security guards froze. Two of them, young men in crisp uniforms who'd been hired to check IDs and escort belligerent visitors, stood paralyzed at the edge of the growing pool of blood. One had his hand on his radio, but couldn't seem to remember how to use it. The other simply stared, his face pale. Around them, the lobby descended into chaos. Women in designer dresses backed away, some crying, some screaming. Men shouted for doctors, for help, for someone to do something. Camera crews swung their equipment toward the scene, instinct overriding decorum. Director Vaughn stood frozen at the podium, his carefully prepared remarks forgotten. But Annabelle Sam moved with the lethal precision of a guided missile. She hit the marble floor on her knees, ignoring the blood soaking instantly through her yellow scrubs. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. Muscle memory, taking over where thought would be too slow. She'd trained for this, not in any official capacity, but during a single, brutal rotation in the Level 1 Trauma Center downtown, where gang violence and car accidents created a steady stream of dying patients. Hill's body convulsed, more blood erupting from his mouth in violent pulses. His eyes were rolling back, his skin now the color of old paper. "Airway first," Annabelle muttered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. She ripped open the crash kit with one hand while using the other to turn Hill's head to the side, preventing him from aspirating the blood into his lungs. The intubation kit, the one she'd technically stolen from the trauma bay, came out in a smooth motion. The laryngoscope blade caught the light as she inserted it, tilting Hill's jaw back with controlled force. Blood filled his airway faster than she could suction it. This was the nightmare scenario, trying to intubate a patient who was actively hemorrhaging into their own throat. "Come on," she whispered. "Just let me see." There, a glimpse of the vocal cords between pulses of blood. She threaded the endotracheal tube with the kind of one-shot precision that came from having done this exact procedure on a gunshot victim who'd been bleeding out in an ambulance bay at 3 a.m. The tube clicked into place. She inflated the cuff, securing the airway, connected the bag valve mask, and began forcing oxygen into lungs that were desperately trying to shut down. But securing the airway was only step one. Hill was bleeding out from somewhere in his upper GI tract, and without surgical intervention, he'd be dead in minutes. But there was a technique, a rarely used, highly specialized procedure that Annabelle had seen performed exactly once by a trauma surgeon who'd trained in military field hospitals. Direct pressure point occlusion. Her hands moved to the specialized suture kit, pulling out a curved clamp that looked more like a medieval torture device than a medical instrument. She palpated Hill's neck, feeling for the external carotid landmarks, counting the anatomical structures with fingers made steady by sheer force of will. "What I'm about to do," she said to no one in particular, "is going to look insane." She made a small, precise incision just above Hill's collarbone, not deep enough to cause damage, but deep enough to access the pressure point where she could manually compress the blood flow to the esophageal region. The clamp slid into place with a soft click. The fountain of blood slowed, then stopped. Around her, the lobby had gone silent again, but this time with awe rather than horror. That's when Gwendolyn's voice shattered the moment. "Annabelle Sam, stop this immediately!" Gwendolyn is about to do something absolutely unforgivable. If you're Team Annabelle, smash that like button right now and let me know in the comments. Gwendolyn had finally broken free of her paralysis and was storming across the lobby, her face twisted with fury and desperation. She grabbed Annabelle's shoulder, trying to physically pull her away from Hill's body. "You are performing an unauthorized procedure outside of a sterile environment. You are violating every protocol. You will lose your license. You will destroy this hospital's liability insurance. Get away from the patient." Annabelle didn't look up. Her voice, when it came, was colder than surgical steel. "His systolic pressure is in the 70s, Gwendolyn. He has approximately 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. Now get me a crash cart, call Dr. Thorne, and get your hands off me." The absolute authority in her voice, the voice of someone who had stopped being a nurse and become something else entirely, made Gwendolyn stumble backward. Annabelle's hands never stopped moving, initiating the IV line, starting the massive fluid resuscitation that Hill's body desperately needed. She was saving his life and ending her career, possibly in the same moment. Gwendolyn stood frozen, her hand still outstretched where Annabelle had shaken it off. The younger nurse's words, "Get your hands off me," echoed through the marble lobby with a force that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with absolute certainty. "Move, Gwendolyn." Annabelle's voice was surgical sharp. "Crash cart, now!" Something in Gwendolyn's face crumbled. Whether it was the recognition of her catastrophic error or simply the raw authority in Annabelle's command, she turned and ran toward the ED. Annabelle's hands never stopped. She cracked open the first liter of saline, spiking the bag with practiced efficiency, and connecting it to the large-bore IV she'd already established in Hill's left antecubital vein. The fluid rushed in, a calculated flood to replace what his body had lost. 2 units of factor 7, she muttered, drawing up the clotting agent with precision. Weight approximately 90 kilograms. Dose is 0.90 milligrams per kilogram. The math happened automatically, muscle memory from countless trauma scenarios. She pushed the medication through the IV port, watching Hill's ashen face for any sign of response. "You, security!" She pointed at the guard still standing uselessly nearby. "Clear this crowd back, 15 feet, minimum. Anyone with medical training, identify yourself. Everyone else, out." The guard moved immediately, grateful for direction. That's when the elevator doors opened and Dr. Cassian Thorne emerged at a run, Zuri and 2 trauma nurses flanking him with a full crash cart. Thorne stopped 3 feet from Annabelle's bloody circle. For 3 critical seconds, he observed the perfectly placed endotracheal tube, the controlled IV infusion, the specialized clamp maintaining pressure point occlusion, the calculated medication administration. His expression shifted from concern to something approaching awe. "Nurse Sam," he said quietly, dropping to his knees beside her. "Report." Annabelle's report was textbook perfect, concise, clinical, devastating in its precision. 45-year-old male, probable ruptured esophageal varix secondary to undiagnosed portal hypertension. Presented with hematemesis, tachycardia at 140, systolic pressure dropping to 72, airway secured with 8.0 ET tube, confirmed placement. 2 large bore lines initiated, 16 and 18 gauge. 1 liter normal saline wide open, second bag running. 0.90 milligrams per kilogram, factor 7 administered at 1623. Manual pressure point occlusion, maintaining hemostasis. She met Thorne's eyes, her voice never wavering, despite the blood coating her hands, her scrubs, her knees. Estimated blood loss approximately 1.5 liters. "He's all yours, doctor." The lobby held its breath. Dr. Cassian Thorne, Yale-educated, board-certified, born into the same world of privilege that had created Noah Hill, looked at the young nurse kneeling in a pool of blood wearing discount scrubs and a $23 stethoscope. Then he nodded. It was a simple gesture, just a slight dip of his head, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But in that single motion was everything. Acceptance of her diagnosis, acknowledgement of her skill, professional respect given freely and without reservation. "Outstanding work, Nurse Sam." His voice carried across the lobby. "Transfer to OR immediately. I want vascular on standby and the GI surgical team prepped. Move." If you're feeling vindicated right now, wait until you see what happens when Hill wakes up. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next part. Things are about to get emotional. The trauma nurses exploded into coordinated action, transferring Hill's body to the gurney with practiced efficiency. Thorne stayed at Annabelle's side as she maintained the pressure point until the transfer was complete. As the gurney rolled toward the elevator, a figure detached from the crowd of onlookers. Percival Vance, Hill's personal assistant, impeccably dressed even in crisis, approached with halting steps. His tablet hung forgotten in one hand. His face was the color of chalk. "You?" His voice cracked. He tried again. "You saved his life." Annabelle stood slowly, her knees protesting. Blood dripped from her gloves onto the marble. "I did my job, Mr. Vance." "No." Vance shook his head, something like wonder in his eyes. "No, you did far more than that. Mr. Hill, he was unspeakably cruel to you. And you still—" He couldn't finish the sentence. 20 feet away, near the security desk, Gwendolyn Pritchett stood frozen in her pristine white coat. Director Vaughn was beside her now, his expression unreadable, but his body language unmistakable. He had seen everything: the dismissal, the collapse, the unauthorized intervention that had saved both a life and the hospital's reputation. Gwendolyn's carefully constructed hierarchy was crumbling around her like ash. Director Sterling Vaughn's office occupied the hospital's top floor, all glass and chrome, with a view of the city that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The late evening sun cast long shadows across his mahogany desk, where a single manila folder sat like an indictment. Annabelle stood before him, still wearing her blood-stained yellow scrubs. No one had given her time to change. Gwendolyn sat rigidly in a leather chair to the left. Her report. 12 pages, meticulously documented, already submitted. Vaughn's fingers drummed against the folder. At 62, he'd survived 3 hospital mergers and countless lawsuits by mastering one principle: minimize liability at all costs. "Nurse Sam," his voice was measured, dangerous. "Do you deny performing an unauthorized invasive procedure outside a sterile environment without physician supervision?" "No, sir." "Do you deny violating direct orders from your supervisor to report to Human Resources?" "No, sir." "Do you deny accessing restricted medical supplies without proper authorization?" "No, sir." Vaughn's eyes narrowed. Then you understand the severity. Mr. Hill's blood pressure dropped from 140/90 to 70/45 in under 3 minutes. Annabelle's voice was steady, clinical. His heart rate was climbing toward 160. Without immediate intervention, he would have arrested before reaching the OR. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, notes she'd made during her mandatory waiting period outside Vaughn's office. I observed dried blood on his collar at 16:13. Metallic breath indicating upper GI bleeding. Thread-like pulse, mottled skin, jugular vein distension. Classic presentation of esophageal varix rupture. The chain of command was superseded by the chain of survival. "That's not your determination to make." Gwendolyn's voice cracked like a whip. "You are a general nursing staff member, not an attending physician." "I'm a nurse who recognized a dying patient." Annabelle met her eyes. "And I had approximately 90 seconds to act." Vaughn leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Pritchett's report documents gross insubordination, reckless endangerment, and—" A knock interrupted him. Dr. Thorne entered without waiting for permission, a thin folder in his hand. His timing was too perfect to be coincidental. "Director Vaughn." He placed the folder on the desk. "My clinical report on Mr. Hill's case. For the record, Nurse Sam's field diagnosis was correct. Her intervention, though unorthodox, was the sole reason Mr. Hill survived to reach surgery. The vascular team confirmed a grade 3 esophageal varix rupture. Minutes later, he would have been unsalvageable." The weight of those words settled over the room like fog. Thorne's eyes met Annabelle's briefly. It wasn't quite a smile, but something close. Then he left. Annabelle stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. She'd made her peace during the long wait outside this office. If her license was revoked, at least she'd chosen correctly. Some things mattered more than career security. Her grandmother's voice echoed, "Your worth ain't in your wallet, it's in your hands." Vaughn opened Thorne's report, reading in silence while Gwendolyn's face grew progressively paler. Noah Hill's recovery suite bore no resemblance to the emergency department where he'd nearly died. Private room. Panoramic windows. Furniture that wouldn't look out of place in a 5-star hotel. Even the monitors were designed to be aesthetically pleasing. Their soft beeps a gentle reminder that his heart was still beating. Because of her. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, a ghost of the man who'd stormed through that lobby 3 days ago. The bruises on his neck where the endotracheal tube had been placed were turning a sickly yellow-green. His throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. The surgical incisions were hidden beneath pristine bandages, but he felt every one of them. The chart on his bedside table told the story his ego didn't want to read. Portal hypertension, grade 3, esophageal varix rupture, genetic predisposition with acute stress trigger. His body, his supposedly invincible, well-maintained, personal trainer-sculpted body, had been trying to kill him for months. The subtle symptoms he'd dismissed as stress, the occasional dizziness, the metallic taste in his mouth, the tightness in his chest. All warnings he'd been too arrogant to heed. The surgeon's words played on repeat in his mind. Without the nurse's immediate intervention, you would have arrested within minutes. The blood loss was catastrophic. Most patients don't survive this outside a surgical suite. Noah Hill, who had purchased politicians and crushed competitors, who owned islands and controlled markets, had been saved by a woman in $23 scrubs while lying in a pool of his own blood. The woman he'd called worthless. The woman he'd threatened to destroy. Share this video right now if you know someone who needs to hear this message. Sometimes the people we underestimate are the ones who save us. His hands trembled, not from weakness, though there was plenty of that, but from shame. It was an unfamiliar emotion, one he'd successfully avoided for most of his 45 years by ensuring he was always right, always powerful, always in control. But you can't negotiate with biology. Can't buy your way out of a ruptured blood vessel. Can't threaten a diagnosis into changing. He'd been powerless. Utterly, completely powerless. And she had saved him anyway. That thought circled his mind like a vulture, picking at the carefully constructed edifice of his worldview. In his universe, everything was transactional. Respect was purchased. Loyalty was bought. People acted in their own self-interest, always. But Annabelle Sam had risked everything. Her career, her license, her future, to save a man who had just tried to ruin her life. Why? The question gnawed at him because he genuinely didn't understand. It violated every principle he'd built his empire on. There was no profit in it, no advantage, only risk. He reached for the call button, his hand still weak. "Get me Director Vaughn," he told the nurse who appeared moments later. "And tell him I want to see Nurse Annabelle Sam. Today." 30 minutes later, Vaughn stood at the foot of Hill's bed, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Hill, I must advise you that Nurse Sam is currently under formal disciplinary review for multiple protocol violations. Having her visit could complicate—" "I don't care about your complications." Hill's voice was hoarse but firm. "She saved my life. I want to speak with her. Of course, but perhaps after the review process. Today, Vaughn." The director's jaw tightened, but he nodded. As he turned to leave, Gwendolyn Pritchett appeared in the doorway, her white coat pristine, her expression a calculated mixture of concern and authority. "Mr. Hill, if I might have a moment before you meet with Nurse Sam." She stepped inside without invitation, pulling out a tablet. "There are several critical facts about that day that you should understand. Her actions, while superficially heroic, were actually reckless violations of established medical protocols. She endangered not just you, but the hospital's entire liability structure. She ignored direct orders, accessed restricted supplies, and performed procedures outside her scope of practice." "Stop!" Hill's single word cut through her prepared speech like a scalpel. He looked at her, really looked at her, and recognized something familiar. The same calculating ambition he'd seen in 1,000 boardrooms. The same self-serving manipulation disguised as institutional concern. "You were there that day," he said quietly. "When I was ranting, when I was insulting her. You were standing there with this satisfied look on your face." Gwendolyn's expression flickered. "Mr. Hill, I was simply trying to diffuse—" "You were enjoying it." His voice was flat, factual. "And when I collapsed, you froze, while she moved." The silence stretched between them. "Get out," Hill said, "and send in Nurse Sam." Annabelle entered Noah Hill's recovery suite still wearing her yellow scrubs. Cleaned now, but the same ones. She'd refused to change them. They were a reminder, for both of them, of where this had started. Director Vaughn stood near the window, his expression unreadable. Gwendolyn lingered by the door, her presence a formality she clearly resented. Hill sat upright in bed, looking smaller somehow, despite the luxury surrounding him. The bruises on his neck were vivid against his pale skin. When he spoke, his voice was rough, broken. "Nurse Sam?" He paused, struggling. "Annabelle, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish." She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. "What I said to you that day." Hill's jaw tightened. "There's no excuse for it. I was cruel. I was contemptuous. I treated you as if your life, your work, your dignity meant nothing because you weren't wearing the right clothes or carrying the right credentials." His hands trembled slightly. "I've spent my entire life believing that money equals worth, that power equals respect, that people like me—" he gestured weakly at the opulent room— "deserve deference simply because we could afford to demand it." "Mr. Hill," Vaughn started. "Let me finish." Hill's voice gained strength. "I was dying. My body was shutting down, and all my billions couldn't stop it. Couldn't even recognize it. But you saw it. You diagnosed it. And despite everything I'd said, Every insult I'd thrown at you. You risked your career to save my life." He reached for the bedside table, pulling out an envelope with shaking hands. "I can't undo what I said. I can't take back the humiliation I caused you. But I can try to make it right." He slid the envelope across the table toward her. $5 million. It's not enough. Nothing could be, but it's a start. For your medical school tuition? No. Comment respect right now if you're proud of what Annabelle's about to say. This moment defines everything. The single word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Annabelle didn't touch the envelope, didn't even look at it. "Mr. Hill, I appreciate your apology. Truly. But I don't need your money." Her voice was steady, clear. "What I need, what everyone who walks through that emergency department needs, is to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they wear or where they come from. That is the price of my care. Not $5 million, just basic human respect." The silence that followed was absolute. Hill stared at her, something like wonder in his eyes. "You're refusing?" "Yes." She met his gaze. "Because if I take your money, this becomes a transaction." And what happened in that lobby wasn't a transaction. It was a reminder that every life has value, including yours, even when you couldn't see mine. Director Vaughn cleared his throat, stepping forward with the careful timing of a man who'd found his opportunity. "Nurse Sam, effective immediately. All disciplinary actions against you are withdrawn." His voice carried the weight of official decree. "Furthermore, after reviewing your clinical performance and Dr. Thorne's recommendation, I'm promoting you to Trauma Nurse Coordinator. Your instincts and skills are precisely what this institution needs." Gwendolyn's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Additionally," Vaughn continued, pulling out his own folder, "the hospital's board has approved a new merit-based scholarship fund for staff pursuing advanced medical degrees. You've been selected as the inaugural recipient. Full tuition, stipend included." Annabelle's composure finally cracked. Her eyes widened. "Director Vaughn, You earned it." His expression softened slightly. "Not through connections or donations, but through exceptional care under impossible circumstances." Hill leaned back against his pillows, a small, genuine smile crossing his face. "The scholarship fund is anonymous, of course, but I may have made a substantial contribution to it. Consider it an investment in the kind of doctor and person this world desperately needs." Annabelle looked between them, then down at her yellow scrubs. "I'll accept the promotion and the scholarship," she said quietly. "Not as compensation, but as recognition that merit matters more than money. That what you do defines your worth, not what you wear." 2 weeks later, Annabelle walked through the hospital's main lobby, now spotlessly clean, the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. Over her yellow scrubs, she wore the crisp white coat of the Trauma Nurse Coordinator, her name embroidered in blue thread. Annabelle Sam, RN, BSN, Trauma Coordinator. Staff members nodded as she passed, respectfully, genuinely. Near the information desk, Gwendolyn stood with a clipboard, her expression carefully neutral. Their eyes met briefly. Gwendolyn looked away first. Annabelle's grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Your worth ain't in your wallet. It's in your hands. In what you do when nobody's watching." She'd been seen now, not because she'd changed, but because she'd never compromised who she was. The yellow scrubs under her white coat were a choice, a reminder, of where she'd come from, and everything she'd earned. If this story moved you, do 3 things right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this with someone who needs to remember that dignity isn't bought, it's earned. Drop a comment telling me what part hit you the hardest. And remember, your worth isn't measured by your wallet. It's measured by what you do when no one's watching. I'll see you in the next one.